I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, a bipartisan resolution that passed the House unanimously urging the United States and European governments to take steps to keep Jewish communities around the world safe. Since 2013, depending on which European country you're looking at, anti-Semitic acts have risen between 100 and 400%. Well, to give us some perspective on what this resolution means, we're so pleased to have on our phones right now from Washington, D.C., Mindy Reinstein, who is the Associate Director for Government and National Affairs of the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League. Mindy, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
Mindy, you used to work on the Hill, correct?
I did.
So you have a sense of how this happens. Give us a sense of what a bipartisan bill or a resolution that passes the House of Representatives urging the United States and European governments to protect Jews. How does it happen and what's it mean to you?
I mean, I think how it happens and what it means to me really go together. It's so symbolic of how lucky we are that Jews in our country aren't alone, and how lucky we are as Americans that the government responds to our concerns in this way. For the Jewish community and for other minorities, for us to be able to go to members of Congress and say that there's a problem, there's a crisis in Europe with anti-Semitism, and we need you to take action, and for them to not only do it, but for them to also call us when they see that it's happening and ask what they can do. And
yes,
that's really what happened in this case with the founding members of the Anti-Semitism Task Force in the House, really reaching out to different organizations and saying, what can we do to respond to Jews being scared in their own communities that they've lived in for so long? So I think that the passage of this, it's an expression that this matters to the United States leadership so much to fight against anti-Semitism wherever it's occurring around the world.
Mindy, who are some of the moving forces behind this resolution?
Sure. So Congressman Chris Smith, the chairman of the Helsinki Commission, introduced the resolution along with Representatives Ted Deutsch, Nina Lowey, Elliot Engel, Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, Kay Granger, Steve Israel, and Peter Roskam. And with them together, recruiting so many co-sponsors and working with major Jewish organizations, not just ADL, AJC, Community Security Trust. There are quite a few others now. Jewish Federations of North America, Simon Wiesenthal Center, Conference of Presidents, and the Orthodox Union. So, it was a major effort. There were a lot of people involved, so a lot of good colleagues and coalition partners.
Mindy, there have been some Jews who've been worried that American Jewish leadership, has not taken an active enough role as we watch the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe that is just, it's breathtakingly terrible. It represents something many of us thought we would never see, certainly in our lifetime. But there was some real feeling that not enough was being done. And it's interesting to hear the way you describe it, that in some way the effort came out of Congress itself, but that where they went was to major Jewish organizations. And you're saying there was some real feedback that American Jews were able to give that helped shape this legislation. Is that a fair analysis?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the really great things about the relationship between staff that work for members of Congress and the Jewish organizations and other organizations that they work with on issues is that we can reach out directly to Jewish communities around the world and check in with them, make sure that as a vulnerable community, do they feel safe with Congress speaking out and bringing more attention to an issue. In this case, it was important. And, for me, it's kind of, I don't see it as the American Jewish community not being active. Maybe that's because I live in it every day. But our new national director, Jonathan Greenblatt, he is in France right now, and he was at the French Jewish Community's National Convention this weekend with the CRIF, with other American Jewish leaders, and speaking about this issue. And I think that one of the best quotes I heard out of the weekend was from Bernard-Henri Levy that said, despite the challenges that Jews are facing in France, they've never been less alone. And I really I really hope that that's the feeling that Jews are feeling in Europe right now. We're also doing some work on the ground in Hungary and Greece, reaching out to communities. And just as important it is for Congress to be taking action and speaking out, and for parliaments in other countries to be taking action and speaking out, it's also important for civil society to be speaking out,
Yes.
for non-Jews to get active and to fight against anti-Semitism as a major human rights issue.
Mm-hmm. Now, Mindy, you're in charge of government and national affairs at the ADL. This is an international issue. How does it come to your desk?
Sure. So we have 3 registered lobbyists over at the ADL. I'm one of them, and what I work on usually is mostly international affairs issues. So, for instance, in this case, fighting against anti-Semitism in Europe would be something that would come to my desk.
I see. One of the things that has also concerned American Jewry is the notion that perhaps the last round of dispute between the White House and the Knesset and the Prime Ministership, between President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu, has created some kind of disruption within the Democratic Party and its support of the State of Israel. In this issue, one of the things that's very important is the extent to which there was bipartisan support in the House for this resolution. I want you to talk about the extent to which, in any way, you are concerned that the bipartisan support that we have enjoyed and has been at the essence, the foundation of American Jewish support for the State of Israel. To what extent are you worried at all that bipartisan support for Israel in Congress is eroding? To what extent does this bill, this resolution, in some way act as an antidote? But talk in general about how you see bipartisan support, not only for Jewish causes and fighting anti-Semitism in Europe, but for bipartisan support of the State of Israel.
Yeah, I mean, I would not characterize it as eroding by any means. It's, of course, a concern right now, and it's been tough times for the Jewish community, for the pro-Israel community. But I think that this resolution in particular is an example of the fact that protecting Jews around the world is not going to become a partisan issue. And in this case, I think it was extraordinary that there are 8 founding members of this task force, which has now grown very large, bipartisan, and then for these bipartisan group of leaders to bring in 89 co-sponsors, and it was split almost, I think it was 44-45 Republican and Democrat. This is not an issue that is going to become a divide, and it actually makes the job of a lobbyist a lot easier when you know that you can go to both sides. You can go to both sides. It's not a partisan issue; it's a human issue. That's
lovely to hear. All right, one other dimension of the resolution, and again, what concerns some in the Jewish community. Mindy, you and I understand it not only has to be an expression of Congress. By the way, it has to be both houses of Congress. What happens now in terms of the Senate, Mindy?
Sure. Well, I think we'll have yet to see. I don't know yet myself if the Senate is planning on introducing a companion resolution. I think that it's a possibility, and I also think it's not a bad thing that the timeline will be spread out a little bit, because it's important to keep the conversation going in that sense. Sometimes it's an important advocacy tool to even kind of keep it going. So I don't know if the Senate is going to take it up yet, although I know that it's something they spend a lot of time on. Last year, the Senate passed a resolution on anti-Semitism in Europe, so it's something that they're focusing on as well.
Okay, again, I'm not asking you to divulge something inappropriate for you to divulge, but to what extent are people like you, who is a lobbyist out of the ADL, to what extent are you communicating to senators about the importance of the Senate doing a similar kind of resolution? And you have a certain number of very visible Jewishly committed senators, both Jewish and non-Jewish, and they're still committed to the Jewish community in the State of Israel. But you have a Chuck Schumer, you have a Dick Blumenthal, you have a Ben Cardin, you have Feinstein. To what extent are you, at the moment, trying to lobby senators to move in the same direction as has been now expressed by the House?
Sure. To what extent? We have conversations about this all the time, not specifically in terms of lobbying them to introduce this resolution, although I think it's a great idea, so thank you for that. But Senator Cardin himself, actually, now that you mentioned him, 2 weeks ago just had a briefing on the Hill about anti-Semitism in Europe and what we can be doing about it. The issue of community security is an incredibly vital one, but also a multi-pronged approach of working with international organizations like the OSCE, as well as more civil society coalition building and bringing other communities into the discussion.
I want to express now a personal thought, and I'm only expressing it for myself, and then I want to hear, Mindy, what your reaction is. You know, the Jewish community has always talked about never again. After the Holocaust, we never wanted to be in the position where we were defenseless and where, in essence, we were the ultimate victim of the darkest night in human history. But never again also applies to the Jewish community outside of Europe, which many felt were silent. And for decisions that they made, perhaps they made them out of good motivations. Perhaps Stephen Wise and the group he represented really believed that if they made World War II a Jewish war, it would undermine Roosevelt's efforts to defeat the Nazis. But there are many who are critical, in hindsight, that the American Jewish community was not vocal enough and did not demand more of the American administration, the American government, during the Holocaust. And what never again also means is the Jewish community will never again be silent. Leadership and rank and file will never be silent again when there are serious threats to world Jewry any place on the face of the globe, and certainly the kind of assaults that the State of Israel has had to endure. And so there are some who argue that what we want now is American Jewish leadership, people like you and the ADL and the AJC and the President's Conference and every Jewish organization. By the way, JBS has a role in this too. We feel responsible that we all have to always be expressing outrage when there are anti-Semitic acts and anti-Semitic statements and anti-Israel statements and the BDS movement. All of us must be as vocal as possible. That never again requires that of us. And one of the things, and now the question, in addition to knowing, I'd love to know the extent to which you believe never again applies to you as a lobbyist and ADL as an organization. One of the things that I want to see happen is I want to see people like you. I want to see the ADL. I want to see the AJC. I want to see the President's Conference. I want to see every major Jewish organization say to our administration, to our legislature, and to the White House, the kind of pressure we put on the Soviet Union to release Soviet Jewry is pressure we want you to put on European governments, that European governments now have a responsibility to protect their Jewish communities, and that a certain kind of American foreign aid, in whatever form it comes, in trade, in military assistance, in intelligence, in cooperations on all levels, is dependent to some extent on European governments taking a very hard stand against anti-Semitism in their local countries and protecting Jewish communities in their host countries. It's not enough simply for America to say, we want European countries to take care of their Jewish communities. We want a certain kind of leverage being used by the American government to force and to insist that European governments protect their Jewish communities. That's a statement on my part. I now would love you to respond, Mindy, in any way you wish.
Sure. Thank you, Mark. Yeah, no, I mean, I hear what you're saying, and I think that that's definitely a notion that I've heard mentioned before. But in terms of how to do it, how to not just say to governments that they need to be protecting their Jewish communities, but leveraging it, rather than leveraging foreign aid, I think raising it as an issue when you're having bilateral talks,
Mm-hmm.
bringing the Department of Justice to do trainings with ministries of justice to better understand that when there's an anti-Semitic incident, how to see it, what to do next, how to work with the community to build more trust and to make them feel more safe. I think that places like the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, recently they've been holding conferences on anti-Semitism. They had one earlier this year on Jewish community security. So I think that American leaders going out and using their bully pulpit to say you're not doing enough, to also tell people when they are doing the right thing. I think the French government is doing their best to respond. One thing that the French Jewish community will say is that the government is actually trying to do everything they can do right now. So I'm not sure about the notion of making foreign aid contingent on that, because it's also having to do with a lot of other things that are very important. But I think the notion of having a Secretary of State, having an ambassador that goes to bilateral meetings and is talking about anti-Semitism as a serious issue is absolutely important. It's critical to raise it when we go to international organizations meetings for the UN, for better or worse for everything it does with Israel, but to hold their first ever conference on anti-Semitism. So I think that there's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of work to be done on the ground with civil society to increase law enforcement trainings for the Jewish communities to make sure that they have the right plans in place, just like this resolution talks about, to keep them safe from anti-Semitic threats. So there's a lot of different ways to do it, and we're trying to tackle it from all of those different ways. And we're very lucky that this is not 1936. We're so blessed. We have a direct line to the White House when something happens dealing with anti-Semitism anywhere around the world. We have a number we can call right away. So it's in a very different position today.
That was beautifully said. I appreciate that answer very, very much, Mindy. You mentioned the White House, by the way. Here you're dealing with the House of Representatives. You're dealing with Congress. To what extent do you personally feel that the White House, that President Obama, the administration as a whole, is sensitive to this problem and is also wants to use whatever power America has to help Jewish communities? You saw that there was an enormous amount of criticism after the murders at the kosher supermarket in Paris, that the president didn't specifically refer to the Jewish victims, but made them generic victims instead. To what extent are you either disappointed in the way in which the White House has handled anti-Semitism throughout Europe? To what extent have things heartened you?
Yeah, I think, and I might be a diehard optimist, so excuse me if that's the situation here, but when the president mentions the word anti-Semitism in his State of the Union, that's not just something he does as a favor. He does it because it's being raised as a critical issue that needs to be talked about, that the country needs to talk about, the world needs to talk about. But also, we're one of the only countries in the world to have a special envoy to combat and monitor anti-Semitism. And we have the State Department that puts out reporting every year where every single embassy around the world is mandated to report on anti-Semitism. So I find myself heartened. The Human Rights Report, country reports just came out recently from the State Department. And to go through that and to find that in the executive summary on the home page, there's actually, I believe 2 or 3 paragraphs just talking about the situation of the crisis of the increase in anti-Semitism around the world, and referring to the incidents that have taken place that we all know about, as you mentioned, Paris as well as Copenhagen. I find us to be in an incredibly fortunate position. We also have an ambassador of the United Nations that talks about anti-Semitism, constantly reiterating that this is a human rights priority. So, I find myself when I go home very often being asked the same question: do you feel that you're getting the support you need on anti-Semitism from the administration? And the answer is yes. I think that as much as we are asking for things, we're seeing them happen. We're seeing the issue being raised constantly, and I hope we can continue being so blessed to have those kinds of relationships.
Okay. Mindy, you're with the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League. From your desk, as you look at the whatever numbers come across your desk about anti-Semitism in Europe and, Mindy, anti-Semitism here in the United States. What's your sense? To what degree is this a serious problem in Europe as opposed to a rise in isolated events? And what about your sense of anti-Semitism in the United States? Take them one by one. What would you have our audience understand about the uptick of anti-Semitism in Europe? You heard this study shows that since 2013, there have been a rise somewhere from 100% to 400%, depending on what European country you're looking at. So that the sense we have is this is a real problem in Europe. And then I also want you to comment on how you feel Jews are doing and what the level of anti-Semitism is in the United States. Take Europe first, then go to the United States.
Sure. So as far as Europe is concerned, it's just not an exaggeration to say that it's on the rise, that it's frightening. I think one of the things we try to do here at ADL is to never exaggerate the seriousness of the situation of anti-Semitism as it's occurring. And here it's real. Less than 2 weeks ago in Athens, there was a Jewish cemetery that was vandalized with swastikas and anti-Jewish graffiti. We've heard from the Special Envoy to Combat and Monitor Anti-Semitism recently about the fear that he's noting from communities that he's visiting in Europe, as well as an uncertainty about the future. And ADL also has done surveys recently, the Global 100. We did a new one on anti-Semitic attitudes in Europe, where we saw that in France in particular, we also saw this in Germany and Belgium, there was a significant decrease in anti-Semitic attitudes, but a significant increase in the concern over the violence. So it's absolutely a real thing. It is frightening,
Yes,
and our
absolutely.
Concerns range from, an increase in anti-Semitic incidents, the worsening of the situation, and the insecurity of those communities. So that's my feeling on Europe. As for the United States, it's of course it's a problem. I don't have any solid data for you right now, but I'm happy to, Mark, I'm sure you can get it from other people at ADL another time. But I think, it's a problem here too. And that's why we're so lucky to be doing all of the education work that we're doing and teaching people about anti-Semitism, how it's manifesting itself, and also just kind of tackling this issue that we saw from our Global 100 survey last year, which was that 70% of the people we found with anti-Semitic attitudes around the entire world had never met a Jew before. Mm-hmm. So it's also connecting people. It's connecting communities.
We are very lucky to have you at that Washington desk for the ADL, Mindy. It's really been a pleasure meeting you. Where are you from originally?
I'm from Fort Lauderdale, Florida.
Uh-huh. And how did you end up first working for the House, and then how do you end up with ADL now?
Sure. I came to Washington after I finished law school, and I was very excited to get an opportunity to work on the Hill for Congressman Al C. Hastings from South Florida, who is incredibly pro-Israel. He's an incredible supporter of the Jewish community and has always taken a stand against fighting anti-Semitism. And I was lucky enough to work with him on all of those issues. And then after about 3 years with him, I found out from ADL that they were looking to replace an open spot. And I've just been so lucky ever since. I literally get paid to come into work every day and work on ADL's mission, which is to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and secure justice and fair treatment for all. And that's really what I've always wanted to do. So,
well, again, we're lucky to have you. Where are your parents now, Mindy?
My father's living in Israel. And which is fantastic to have another home in Israel, and my mother and my stepfather are in South Florida still.
Well, I'm sure they're very, very proud of you. It's been a joy meeting you. I hope you'll let me call you often whenever there's an issue that I feel you can give us some insight in. In the meantime, I wish you all the best. Kol tuv v'hatzlacha. We will talk often. Again, I appreciate your presence.
Thank you so much, Mark. Take care.
You be well. The thoughts of Mindy Reinstein, who is the Associate Director for Government and National Affairs for the Anti-Defamation League, and she works out of Washington, D.C., and she gives us a sense of where things stand here. One has to applaud the House of Representatives for this bipartisan resolution telling America and the European nations that they must protect the Jewish communities. The only thing is we want to make sure there's some substance to it, that it's not simply a resolution of words, but that it in some way will impel and provide a way, a means of propelling both the American government and European governments to be as proactive as they can be, not simply, again, with words alone, but by protecting the Jewish communities of all the countries of Europe, and of course the country here, here in the United States, the Jewish community here, which again, I don't know what you experience personally. I do not experience anti-Semitism in my life. I feel that we are very, very fortunate to live in the United States during the 21st century. It's not that I think there is no anti-Semitism in this country. There are, crazy, outlandish acts that crazy, outlandish people do from time to time. But in the main, the United States of America is a real bastion of safety and security for the Jewish community, and I hope it remains that way. And I believe we have a Congress and a system that will help do that. And we also hope that the White House is committed also to a United States of America where every minority is protected, and it is the strength of this country, and again, how lucky we are as American Jews. My thanks as always to our director, Sloan Copeland, production coordinator, Serge Goldberg, JBS's associate director, Dara Golub, and the producer of In the News, Carol Lilienthal. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.